Welcome to the 7th grade video on Standard MS-PS1-6, Matter and its Interactions. Let's start by reading the standard and clarifying the expectations for students. Standard MS-PS1-6. Undertake a design project to construct, test, and modify a device that either releases or absorbs thermal energy by chemical processes. What students do need to know. This standard will require the students to construct, test, and modify a device that will release or absorb thermal energy through a chemical reaction. What students do not need to know. The assessment limit. Students will observe how the amount of a reactant affects the time or temperature of the reaction. So students should be focusing on chemical reactions versus insulators and conductors. Comparing standards. Let's now explore how this standard will continue in high school and build upon knowledge learned in middle school. So, the middle school standard was focused on how changing the reactants can change what happens to the energy released or absorbed. Whereas in high school, they're developing a model to illustrate that the release or absorption of energy from a chemical reaction system depends on the changes in the total bond energy. So they're talking more about the bonds and how that, on the molecular level, changes the amount of energy that goes into or out of the system. Let's start with our phenomenon, Whack-A-Bag. You can purchase the Whack-A-Bags at the Dollar General or Dollar Tree. The students will observe the bag before the demonstration. So you can have either the teacher or the student hit the bag with your fist on a table, and the students will watch as the bag pops and the balloon pops out of the bag and expands. And then you can also let them feel the balloon and how it gets cold. There is a link in the slides to the activity where they can post their observations before and after. And you can even go into the ingredients and what's inside and how the reactants changed chemically once they were combined. Resource example number 1. Students will conduct a two-part investigation to determine what happens during an endothermic and an exothermic reaction. So they'll be using baking soda and vinegar and yeast and hydrogen peroxide to draw conclusions about what happens during that chemical reaction. And we have a link to the charts as well as the graphs, and there's a picture of the finished graph and what it would look like once they are finished the lab. Resource number 2, sunset in a bag. Students will observe changes in the sunset in a bag lab. They will then see what happens to the temperature when the amount of reactants increases from 1 tablespoons to 3 tablespoons. So there's a link for the lab activity. It's more of like a demonstration that you do together, and you add more of the reactants to see what happens, and then they can identify whether it was an endothermic or exothermic reaction when you add the various items. Resource example number 3, the science behind a cold pack. Students will explore endothermic reactions by comparing the temperature changes that result from various chemicals added to water. As an extension of this activity, students will write their own experimental procedures to see how they can produce the greatest temperature decrease. Thanks for listening to the video, and if you have any questions, you may contact the AACPS Science Office at the website below.